This week on the Hollywood and Toto podcast, we've got some tough love for conservatives when it comes to pop culture. And we speak to Nico Perrino. He's one of the fiercest free speech warriors around. He's got some good news and some not so good news about free speech and freedom in 2024. You're going to want to hear that.
Welcome to the Hollywood and Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Before we kick things off, I hope you'll subscribe to the Hollywood and Toto podcast. We are on iTunes, Rumble, YouTube, pretty much all the places on the video and audio landscape. Do check it out. Tell a friend. Spread the word. It's how these shows grow, and I appreciate it. Gonna be blunt, I think conservatives have a shut up and sing problem. Yes, conservatives have been railing against Hollywood for years and years. Stay out of politics. I can't believe you just said that. I'm not watching another Sean Penn movie or Mark Ruffalo movie. Did you hear what they said about Trump or any other figure from the GOP? And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that. And sometimes I may have said that myself, but and then Kid Rock comes along or Hulk Hogan speaks to the RNC. And what do the conservatives do? Sometimes including myself. Bravo, bring it on. More, please, more. Well, which is it? Do you want celebrities to shut up and sing? Or do you want them to speak out if they happen to be right of center? There's a little bit of a hypocrisy issue there for sure. But I want to drill down a little bit deeper because I think there is a problem here. And I think that the heart of the matter is probably accurate. Because when it comes to politics, celebrities, well, they're either not that bright, they're not that well informed, or they don't even try. And I think they don't even try because they're never, ever questioned about their political leanings. You know, if Ben Stiller was going to pop up on the red carpet and he makes a political statement, the person on the other side of the microphone isn't going to say, you know, Mr. Stiller, why do you feel that way? Or did you know X, Y, or Z? And dress them down. Or just even ask just a tough question. It's not going to happen. And so you end up with people like Ben Stiller saying things like this.
I wish I was black. Every white Jewish guy wishes he was black. You know, it's going to be the first woman president. And that's incredibly exciting. And, you know, she's Indian, she's black, she's everything. You can be more than one thing. It's incredible, you know.
Does your brain hurt? Mine, I felt something up here. Not good, not good. And it's even more alarming because Ben Stiller's a smart guy, a terrific director, a great comic actor. Is that all he's got? Is that his best pitch for Kamala Harris? Love her or hate her, I think she deserves better. So that's the problem with when Hollywood celebrities get political. It's just not that interesting or well informed. Often it's just downright dumb. Remember back years ago during the heart of the Iraq war situation, there were a lot of celebrities just absolutely revolting against President Bush. And Rolling Stone had this large article where they compiled a whole bunch of different actors, celebrities, singers, and let them opine on the issue of the day. And they did. And boy, was it dumb. I mean, poorly thought out, filled with misinformation. Just even if you agreed with their commentary, you think, maybe you need to reword this. Maybe this needed a second and third draft. So it's not a new problem. It's been around forever. So, you know, but having said all that, if a Ben Affleck comes along and has something heartfelt to say about politics and can back it up with facts, logic, and reason, to paraphrase the great Dan Bongino, well, then maybe it's worthwhile. Maybe it's worth listening to. Maybe we can have that as part of the conversation. But so often, celebrity political banter is just, it makes your teeth hurt. It really does. And we're going to get a lot of it in the next few days. Obviously, celebrities are rushing to Kamala Harris's side. The DNC is just a few days away as well. You'll see more of that there. Julia Louis-Dreyfus is promising to have a very sharp focus on Harris's campaign. I bet you Kamala Harris's people are like, yeah, you know, we're good. You are on Veep. There's a lot of comparisons there. They're not flattering. Maybe you could step aside, but you know, I don't think that's going to happen. So I think moving forward, the shut up and sing sentiment, I get it. I understand it. I relate to it sometimes, but let's push that aside and just hold celebrities accountable for what they say. And also, let's mock them when they share egregious misinformation on social media, which happens a lot. I've seen tons of celebrities just sharing out and out lies not having any repercussions. There's no fact-checking organization that's going to hold them accountable. It should. They have clout. They have celebrity. They've got a big platform. They should be held accountable. They should be told, hey, that is wrong. You probably should have a correction or at least take down that tweet. They never do it. So just know that going forward, that's what we're going to expect for the next 90, 100 days. I don't know how much time is left in the campaign, but celebrities, keep speaking out. It's your First Amendment right. God bless you. We can wince. We can critique you. We can shudder. We can cringe when necessary. Thank you, Ben Stiller. But just know, no matter where you stand on celebrities speaking out on politics, understand that there's a whole half of the country or a group in Hollywood that can't speak out, that are afraid to say something because they don't fit in with the group narrative on politics. They're called conservatives and libertarians, and with some very few exceptions, including Vince Vaughn, John Voight for sure, maybe even like a Tim Allen, they hide their views. They shy away from sharing what they really want to say. They don't go on social media. They know that there will be repercussions for having the wrong views. So I wish that celebrities, in between the politicking, in between the let's go Kamala Harris, maybe they could speak out for them too, because they need a voice desperately. Hollywood in Toto is about entertainment, full stop. I don't get into hardcore politics. You're not going to hear any white paper-esque treaties here, but I do allow for some overlap when it comes to free speech. Why? It couldn't be more important. It couldn't be under more attack than it is right now. And I just understand that when it comes to free speech and creativity, they work hand in hand. They are together. They are essential. One cannot exist without the other, which is why I have people like Nico Perrino on the show. He is the executive vice president of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and they do a masterful job fighting for free speech, the First Amendment, bringing light to terrible issues going on in the culture. So why have Nico on the show? Well, for starters, I wanted to get his thoughts on cancel culture. Is it getting better? Are comedians feeling a little bit more wiggle room to say what they want to say? And also, I wanted to just check in and say, how are we doing? To quote the great Ed Koch from New York City. Are we having some progress on free speech? Are there victories to be shared? Are there increasing number of people who are aghast at the mere notion of free speech? There's some bad news on that front. So we get into all of that in this conversation. I hope you enjoy my chat with Nico Perrino. I hope you check out FIRE. It is a wonderful organization. They're fighting the good fight. They're doing the work that the ACLU used to do, but they basically stepped back and said, hey, free speech, what's that? Not our interest. It's a shame, but thank goodness for FIRE for stepping in and doing the good, noble work. And thank you to people like Nico Perrino, whose So to Speak podcast is all about the First Amendment and all about the freedom to say what we want to say. Because when you look around the country and then you look even more across the globe, it is under attack. And the more people like Nico, the better. Well, Nico, I feel like I'm obsessed with free speech. It's your bread and butter. And as much as I think of myself as an optimistic person, I haven't felt that way in the free speech arena of late. So I need you to either confirm my fears or talk me down. What's your sense right now of where we are culturally speaking with free speech? Because I can't think of many people, maybe Greg Lukianoff, who are as embedded with this issue as you are. So shoot straight here. What's pessimistic, optimistic, a little bit of both? Where do we stand right now?
It depends how you want to look at it. I think if you're looking to be pessimistic, you can find facts and answers that would confirm that bias. But if you also want to be optimistic, you can find stuff on that side of the ledger as well. On the optimistic side, for the most part, I think the Supreme Court, in this past Supreme Court term, got its cases right. My colleague, Bob Corn-Revere, who has been practicing First Amendment law for the last 40 years, was a partner at Davis Wright Tremaine before he came to work at FIRE, said that this was the most significant term at the Supreme Court for the First Amendment in his entire career. Wow. It had some very significant questions, right? Yeah. It took up questions surrounding content moderation from laws in Texas and Florida. It raised questions about government jawboning, that is the government sort of coercing private entities to do what they want through threat of punishment. It had questions surrounding trademarks. It had questions surrounding so much to do with emerging technologies and issues that the First Amendment hasn't grappled with for years. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think they got it right. Now, some folks are going to disagree with FIRE's position on the Texas and Florida laws. These were laws in Texas that would have prevented social media platforms from engaging in viewpoint discrimination. In Florida, it was a little bit narrower. It would have limited social media companies' ability to moderate publications, news publications, and politicians, passed in the wake of what the social media companies did in response to the Hunter Biden laptop story and the deplatforming of Donald Trump. But ultimately, these are private entities, and it's FIRE's position, and it's my personal position that they should have the freedom to moderate content as they choose, even if I disagree with the ways that they are doing. I think giving the government that power is problematic. So that's the Supreme Court continues to be good on the First Amendment, fortunately. We can go deep on that if you want. On the other side of the ledger, you see this continuing decline in young people's support for free speech and for First Amendment principles. FIRE has conducted the largest ever studies of college students' attitudes about free speech over the last couple of years. Our most recent survey was of over 50,000 college students. And year over year, we're seeing support for violence in response to speech that students don't like, in support of shouting down speakers, support of blockading speakers on college campuses. So if you have the Supreme Court sticking to the First Amendment on one side, but you have young people where that support is falling away, you worry about what's going to happen when the young people start getting to the bench, getting to the Supreme Court, right? Judge Learned Hand, in a famous 1944 speech in Central Park, said, "The spirit of liberty lives in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, there's no parchment barrier, there's no constitution, there's no law that can save it." So we need that spirit of liberty to continue if the law is going to continue to be strong on these values.
How do we reach out to that generation to kind of say, hey, you don't understand what's happening here? I mean, I don't want to be the old guy shaking my fist at the clouds, but I think we can both agree that this is a significant issue and something that's worrisome from a cultural point of view. How do we break through their thinking? I mean, just the violence in response to speech alone should leave everyone aghast. How do we connect with this generation? What's the
violence is the most fearsome part, right? Because once you break down the barrier between speech on one side and violence on the other, the whole ballgame goes out, right? Words are what we use in lieu of violence. Sigmund Freud is once said to have said that civilization was started the day man first cast a word instead of a stone. Words are how we solve our disputes in society. And if words can be violence, then you're justified in meeting words with violence. So that's really dangerous. And I do not like the trend where young people are, one, conflating words with violence, and two, thinking that they're justified in meeting words with violence. But I'm also reassured by studying the history of free expression that you go through these periods of tumult periodically. Censorship has been the norm throughout human history. Free speech has not been. We went through this kind of weird period in the second half of the 20th century where free speech seemed to be an ascendant value. You had leadership within our news institutions, within our academic institutions, within our broader culture that seemed to just support free speech values, largely on the backs of a sort of generation of civil libertarians who saw how censorship was used to persecute labor organizers, civil rights activists, women's rights activists. They almost came to free speech as a result of seeing these other values that they held near and dear attacked. And then they were able to get those values reflected in the First Amendment. Recall that no conviction was overturned on First Amendment free speech grounds until 1931. So for 140 years after the First Amendment was first passed in 1791, the First Amendment essentially meant nothing. And then there was this generation of civil libertarians that gave it new meaning. And I'm actually putting together a book proposal right now to talk about that generation of civil libertarians. But you keep having to fight. And if their story is any lesson, I think you almost need your own ox to be gored, your own sacred values to be attacked in order to realize that it's really important that you have the freedom to express them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens across the board. When something affects you personally, all of a sudden you have a whole new outlook on things. I mean, we've seen that with actors who become activists. Michael J. Fox comes to mind, but I've seen actors who are rather unconcerned about free speech issues, and then when they're silenced, all of a sudden they tend to rise up and think, "Wait a minute, what's going on?"
Well,
I
you might
want
see
to.
that a little bit with the pro-Palestinian protests on college
Yes,
campuses.
yes.
Now, a lot of these activists are confusing what is protected speech and what is unprotected speech. We could talk about that, but they are having, or at least articulating, a broader appreciation for free speech. We'll see if it extends to their ideological opponents as well.
Yeah, I want to bring up. You mentioned I listened to a recent episode of So to Speak, and you were talking about the assassination attempt, the attempts to quell violent speech, rhetoric, things like that. It's something we often run into,
Mhm.
and I'm not your level of free speech warrior, but I'm a couple notches below, so I understand the need for it and why we can't silence people. But I also noticed how Jack Black was on stage and his bandmate sort of said, "Hey," jokingly, "Hey, let's not miss next time." And then almost days later, the Green Day lead singer Billy Joe Armstrong holds up a Trump head like a mask, like a head,
Mhm.
and there was no blowback. I just thought, I know we don't want to restrict the speech, but is there some sort of cultural level, almost a shaming indicator to say, "Hey, that's wrong"? I mean, I don't even know how to ask the question. I just want to get your thoughts because
Well, yeah, I
it's
think
such
you're
a
totally
weird
right.
dichotomy there.
The one trade-off that you make by
Mhm.
having a legally robust protection for free expression is that you can have this sort of social ostracization, this social
Mhm.
consequences that come from saying things that transgress society's norms. Now, I want to be careful because I do think that can also
Mhm.
lead to illiberalism. I think cancel culture went too far.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
this has been a thread throughout American history. I mean, you had Alexis de Tocqueville coming from France into America and talking about essentially cancel culture, about the culture of conformity that existed in America that wasn't imposed through laws necessarily, but
Mhm.
rather the cultural orthodoxy. And you even have it in England in the 1850s and 1860s when you have John Stuart Mill writing his famous treatise on liberty, which talks for the most part about the social orthodoxy and conformity of Victorian England and the tyranny of the majority. We've heard that phrase before. So there has been this thread of kind of social condemnation, of boycotts that it has existed throughout American history. And I think you're just always going to have that in a society, and maybe you
Mhm.
need to have that in a society where you have strong legal protections. At the same time, something just rubs me the wrong way about hearing someone who you disagree with say what they say, and then rather than try and defeat their arguments in the court of public opinion,
Mhm.
rather win the argument by going to their boss and trying
Right.
to get them fired, right? Or trying to get them to lose their livelihood or ruin the life of their family. There's just something different about that. And
Mhm.
I argue for a society in which our instinct when we hear something we don't like isn't to figure out some way to shut them up or to censor them, but rather to beat them with argumentation in the marketplace of ideas, to
Mhm.
have arguments with them, to maybe call them out, but not call up Home Depot and try and get them fired from their minimum wage job.
Yeah, it's funny because of social media, we have that ability to have those conversations, yet we often short circuit it by going directly to, "I'd like to speak to your manager."
Yeah.
I grew up in the 80s, and I sense and feel, and my memories tell me that both Hollywood and the media in general, and I'm speaking generalities, they supported free speech. I often see the opposite these days. I see a Hollywood industry that doesn't stand up for free speech for the most part. There are certainly
Mhm.
wonderful exceptions, and I see articles. I mean, when a Joe Rogan or Dave Chappelle enters the conversation, I can see the tone of the articles that are written about those individuals, and it's nasty, it's negative, it's divisive. It's almost like shut them down. I'm being a little bit aggressive in that phrasing, but not that much. Why do
Mhm.
those institutions turn on something that seems so essential to their DNA?
It's a good question. I wish I had the answer. I think part of it has to do with the lack of ideological diversity that
Mhm.
exists in those institutions,
Yeah, yeah.
and the persecution and orthodoxy. It becomes a self-fulfilling cycle,
Mhm.
right? So the more orthodox it is, the more orthodox it becomes in the long run.
Mhm.
But you do see that sometimes all it takes is just one dissenting voice, whether it's in an industry or within a publication, to shift the conversation a little bit. We've seen how that's occurred a little bit with social media after Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter. There seems to have been a dam that's broken whereby the conversation has loosened up or opened up, and you might think that's a bad thing, depending on which side of the ideological fence you are on. But I do think it has happened, and this speaks to Cass Sunstein's law of group polarization. This idea being that you become more extreme in one direction or another, the fewer dissenters there are within that group. And
well, that explains it beautifully. I think when you look at the media in Hollywood, I think they've been more ideologically pure in recent years, and I think that maybe that's the result we're seeing.
Yeah, and it probably also explains academia as well. Although I do see movements within some administrations to try and increase the ideological diversity within their student body and within their faculties, especially when you have a truth-seeking institution like academia. You do need that dissenting voice. You need these systems of institutional disconfirmation in order to arrive at the truth. So news media is the same, right?
Yeah.
To the extent you see it as a truth-seeking institution, although there is a conflict within the news media right now surrounding the idea of objective journalism on the one hand, which prevailed in the latter part of the 20th century, versus this theory of moral clarity, the idea that we know what is good and right and just, and therefore we don't need to pretend to be objective about our reporting. Particularly in the wake of Donald Trump's election in 2016, you've seen those arguments.
I don't think they know what's moral and right and just, but that's just my opinion. This show, like myself, this is a right-leaning presentation. I don't want to chase people on the left away, but I also want to maybe give a little tough love, because I know you cover this subject pretty aggressively. Maybe give a few examples where either cancel culture or attacks on free speech have come from the right, because I think we've seen that bubble up in your recent years, even though I think, generally speaking, the left has been much more problematic in this area, but certainly the right is not immune. What's happening there?
Well, you mentioned in the wake of the attempted assassination on President Trump that there were efforts, people who made off-color and sometimes offensive jokes about it, saying they wish that the bullet had hit them. In that case, in some of those cases, not even jokes, just wishes. And then you get the calls to their employers to try and get them fired. Most famously, this this low-earning Home Depot employee who lost her job as a result of that. The biggest threat to free speech we see right now, and it's somewhat coming from the right, although I think it is a bipartisan effort, is the effort to restrict access to the free and open internet in the name of kids. So whether it's restricting access to porn websites or to social media by requiring identity verification in order to get access. This would be the first time in the history of the United States that we've said that you've needed to submit your government ID in order to access a portion of the internet. Never before have we done that. And I see that as a huge threat to the free and open internet on the one hand, but also privacy on the other hand. And some of this is precipitated by Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a number. In Jonathan Haidt, he and I go way back. We've known each other for 10 years, worked with him on my boss, Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Greatly respect him. And I think 95% of what he puts forward in that book, it would be smart parenting advice. I have two kids of my own, right? And I'm sure I will adopt most of it. But when he starts getting into government policy, the idea that you need to age gate certain aspects of the internet, I think that's worrisome. And you're starting to see some of those laws passed in certain countries. And the Supreme Court is going to take up the question again next term. It has already taken up the question 3 times in the late 1990s and early 2000s, striking down these age verification laws. Texas passed one that went into effect. So I think that's why they're taking it up again. But I do worry that it's going to go a different way this time. So we'll see. So that's the big question I'm looking at right now.
Yeah. When you come to this conversation, you attack it from a pure point of view. You're not a partisan. You see problems on both sides. So I want to ask you about this. How do we get through to people who disagree with the free speech just in general? When you're talking to someone, they may say, "Well, that Trump, I don't want him on X or Facebook." I mean, I want to arm people with conversational weapons, for lack of a better phrase, where we can kind of get through to people. I think it's such a critical point in our culture, and we're so divided, because I think if we run head first with our helmets on, fists blazing, that it does nothing. But I
So
would suspect you're the kind of person, if you're at a cocktail party and you find someone disagrees with you on free speech, you can make some headway. You might would do far better than I would. What are some either tactics you use or just maybe even examples where you've spoken to someone about free speech, they disagreed with you, but then you saw there was some progress, some minds being opened?
Asking people to just always consider it with the shoe on the other foot is helpful. So Ira Glasser, I made this documentary called Mighty Ira, which is about the life and career of former ACLU executive director Ira Glasser, a staunch free speech advocate, in my opinion. And he has this saying that he says that censorship is like poison gas. It's a great weapon when the wind is at your back and the enemy is in your sights, but then the wind has a way of shifting and blowing back on you. The same sort of tools for censorship that you want to use against your ideological enemy can be used too against you. And he gives this example from the National Union of Students in England in the 1970s. They were considering passing a hate speech code for the college campuses over there, and they solicited the Zionist student group in the UK to endorse the hate speech code, which they did gladly. Turns out a couple years later, the National Union of Students decided that Zionism was a form of hate speech and banned the Zionist student organization. That is censorship in a nutshell.
Yeah.
That is censorship in a nutshell. I'm a big fan as well. This is a right-leaning podcast, so maybe you guys aren't all fans of Christopher Hitchens, the famous polemicist from the 20th century.
I think he's fascinating, but continue.
Whatever you think of him, he's a great arguer. And he gave the speech in the latter 2000s in Canada, I still think the best speech on free speech ever made, in which he turns to the audience and asked them, who among you would trust anyone with censorship? Who would you trust to determine for you what books you can read, for you what movies you can watch, for you what speeches you can hear, for you what books you can read? He says, there's not a person in the world with whom I would entrust that responsibility. And if this angel did exist, what would happen when they're gone? Right? They would need to be immortal like an angel, right? In order for you to trust them with the power of censorship. So if you agree with the power being rested with Donald Trump today, how are you going to feel about it in the hands of Kamala Harris tomorrow? So this kind of idea that what's good for the goose is good for the gander prevails on most people, I find.
Yeah.
So
that's a great point. By the way, years ago, I interviewed Christopher Hitchens. I was a green reporter. I did no homework. He was an intellectual giant, and I'm sure he saw right through me, and he couldn't have been kinder, by the way. I have sort of a warm spot in my heart for him just because he could have been dismissive of me, and he should have been because I was so ill prepared. I talk a lot in this show about cancel culture. I interview a lot of comedians. We just spoke to Jarek Richards last week. I don't know how far you get in the weeds in this arena, but I feel like there have been some positive notices here. I think that Netflix standing up for Dave Chappelle was a significant cultural event. And I feel like, we've seen the roast of Tom Brady. Netflix is, giving a platform to Joe Rogan and Shane Gillis. I see progress here. I don't know how well you're into this arena. It certainly works in your field, but any thoughts on that? Or am I on the right path, or do you see progress here as well?
I do see a vibe shift for sure. How you actually quantify that and measure it is hard to say.
Sure.
But I'm pretty attuned to what's happening in the free speech, not just the First Amendment legal space, but also the culture space. And it does seem that cancel culture is somewhat waning, that the space is opening up, that companies are growing a backbone and willing to stand up to the bullies who want them to take content down or deplatform folks. That Netflix moment was a watershed moment in certain respects. And not only did they not break on the Dave Chappelle special, they also incorporated into their famous company handbook this policy on creative expression, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see that across industries right now, where it's one thing to not break. It's another thing to actually incorporate these values into your company policies so that you have something that you can tie yourself to during future controversies. In academia, we're urging these colleges and universities to adopt positions on institutional neutrality. That is, on things outside the core function of the university, we're not taking positions. So we're not taking positions on the presidential election, on the war in Ukraine, on the war in Israel, on the abortion case at the Supreme Court a few years ago. We're staying out of that stuff. We are the host and sponsor of critics, not the critics ourselves.
Yeah.
And what policies like this do is essentially it's like Odysseus being tied to the mast, right? You can point to them when the next controversy flares up and say, you want us to blacklist this person? You want us to we can't. We got this policy, right?
Yeah. One last question before we let you go. Is there a subset of the free speech debate, conversation, situation that we're not talking about enough, but we should be? A subset, an issue, a theme, a fight, a battle, something that just is not on the tip of our tongues. We all talk about Dave Chappelle. We all talk about those recent Supreme Court decisions, but this is your bailiwick. What's out there that we should be thinking more about that maybe we're not?
Just the bullies at the local level. So you see low-level bureaucrats in states and municipalities that are censoring their citizens at town halls or at city council meetings, and fire litigates these cases, but they don't get much attention. And I understand why, right? They affect a small subset of the population, and unless you capture it on video or they say something totally absurd, it's just not going to go viral. But nevertheless, these are our First Amendment rights in action, and they need to be protected at the lower level of our state and municipal governments, is in the same way they do at the federal level. And also the use of defamation lawsuits to shut people up when you disagree with them. We see that a lot. And there are laws passed in different states called strategic lawsuits against public participation, which allow folks to dismiss these lawsuits fairly quickly so they don't bankrupt you. It's often something people use. These defamation lawsuits are often something rich people will use to shut up people who are not of the same means. So that's the stuff that we do every day here at Fire that doesn't capture as much attention, but we think is nevertheless important.
Gotcha. And you mentioned those smaller incidents. I don't think they're as small as we think, because once you live through that, maybe you witness it, maybe you hear about it, it has maybe a cumulative effect where you think, okay, I'll just be quiet, I'll self-censor. And then many, many people are doing the same. And that maybe leads to where we are right now sometimes. But well, Nico, thank you for joining the show. Of course, you can check out the So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, available on all the different platforms, iTunes. Also, I know it's on YouTube as well. And also check out your movie, Mighty Ira, like you mentioned, the former head of the ACLU during a critical time in the 1970s. Where can people see that, by the way? I know I often steer folks to justwatch.com. It's kind of a great resource to find streaming platforms, but do you have a recommendation for where people can check that out?
There's a number of different platforms you can watch the film. I know it's on Apple TV. It's on Google Play. It's on most places. It's on Amazon, of course. All these you have to pay to watch it, but it's also, the film did really well in the Jewish community because it talks about the case in Skokie involving Nazis rallying in town of Holocaust survivors. So it did the Jewish Film Festival circuit. So there are a couple of streaming platforms that host that content that are streaming it as well. If you Google it, you'll find a number of different places. It's not on Netflix, but it is on Apple TV, Google Play, and Amazon.
Excellent. We'll definitely check that out, and appreciate your time, and keep fighting the good fight. Sometimes it's not glamorous. Sometimes it goes under the radar, but what you're doing with the show, with the work you do, of course, with Fire, it's what we need right now. So thanks again.
Anytime, Christian.
Well, that's it for the show this week. A quick apology. I did not have my mic directed in my face during the opening of my interview with Kay Smythe recently. I realized my error after the first question, but those are just the bumps along the way when you start a YouTube channel. But you think I would have ironed that out prior to the show going live, but heck, I didn't. So my humble apologies. Hope you're enjoying the show overall, despite the technical glitches. Anything you want to see on the show, any guests you are curious to hear more from, you can always write me, Christian@HollywoodInToto.com. Love to hear your feedback, the good and the bad, and less so the ugly, but if it's ugly, let me have it. I'm a big boy. I can handle that kind of criticism, but I do like the gentle and constructive type more so than anything else. And again, if you get a chance, after you've watched this show, after you listened on the podcast, on the audio platforms, I do hope you'll check out HollywoodInToto.com. This is the site's 10-year anniversary. I'm doing some tinkering behind the scenes to make it even better than before. That's going to be a work in progress. I don't think you're going to see the results right away, but I hope you'll keep checking out the site. I update it 7 days a week. You've got news, reviews, commentary, everything about culture from a right of center perspective. I hope my left-leaning friends do check it out as well. They are not pushed away. I hope they're not scared away. I won't be demonizing them. I won't be name calling them. It's not how we roll here at the show and the website, but maybe you'll have a different perspective on Hollywood after you listen to the show or after you read the website. Again, it's hollywoodintoto.com. And if you like the podcast, I think you got the name down pat. I will see you all next time.